The day I found the envelope, I realized that the most dangerous secrets are not buried underground. They are hidden in the places we stop looking. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 71 years old, and until that autumn afternoon, I believed the hardest part of my life was learning how to live without my husband. Thomas had been gone for almost 5 years. The grief had softened around the edges, but it never truly disappeared. Some mornings I still reached across the bed expecting to find him there. Some evenings I still caught myself saving stories I wanted to tell him. The house felt different without him, quieter in a way that no amount of television or background music could fix. That afternoon, I was cleaning the old study at the back of the house. It had once been Thomas's favorite room. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, and the scent of old paper still lingered in the air. I had been meaning to organize the room for years, but every time I started, I found myself overwhelmed by memories. On that particular day, however, something pushed me forward. Perhaps it was the cool October weather. Perhaps it was simple determination. Whatever the reason, I finally began sorting through boxes that had not been touched since my husband died. Most of what I found was ordinary. Tax records, old magazines, warranty manuals for appliances we no longer owned. Then I noticed a loose section of paneling behind a filing cabinet. At first, I thought it was simply damaged wood. When I moved the cabinet aside, however, I discovered a narrow opening hidden behind it. My heart began beating faster. The space was only a few inches deep, but something had been placed inside. I reached in carefully and pulled out a large envelope covered in dust. The paper had yellowed with age. Across the front, written in my husband's unmistakable handwriting, were words that instantly made my stomach tighten. "If you are reading this, Evelyn, then I was right to worry." I stood frozen in the middle of the room. Thomas was not a dramatic man. During 43 years of marriage, I could count on one hand the number of times he had spoken in a way that sounded even remotely alarming. He believed in facts, not fear. If he wrote those words, he had a reason. I carried the envelope to his old desk and sat down slowly. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the room. For several moments, I simply stared at the envelope resting in my hands. My mind raced through possibilities. Had he hidden money? Family photographs? A letter he never had the chance to give me? Then another thought entered my mind. What if this was connected to the strange conversations that had taken place after his death? Over the years, my daughter-in-law Melissa had asked surprisingly specific questions about the house, my finances, and what plans I had for the future. I always assumed she was being thoughtful. Now, for the first time, I wondered if there was another explanation. My hands trembled slightly as I slid a finger beneath the seal. Whatever waited inside that envelope had remained hidden for years, and something deep inside me whispered that once I opened it, nothing in my family would ever look the same again. For several moments, I simply stared at the envelope resting on Thomas's old desk. Outside the window, a cool autumn wind rattled the branches of the maple tree in the backyard. Inside the study, the silence felt almost unnatural. It was the kind of silence that makes you aware of every small sound. The ticking clock on the wall, the creak of old floorboards, the faint rustle of paper beneath my fingertips. I finally opened the envelope and carefully removed its contents. On top was a handwritten letter. Beneath it sat several folders and what appeared to be copies of legal documents. My pulse quickened immediately. Thomas had always been organized, but this felt different, deliberate, planned, as though he had spent considerable time preparing for the day I would find it. I unfolded the letter first. "My dearest Evelyn," it began. The familiar words immediately brought tears to my eyes. During our marriage, Thomas wrote me dozens of letters. Anniversary notes, birthday cards, small messages left beside the coffee maker. Even after all these years, seeing his handwriting felt like hearing his voice. I continued reading. The first page was gentle, loving. He spoke about our life together and how grateful he was for every year we shared. Then the tone gradually shifted. By the second page, his words became more serious. He explained that during the final year of his life, he noticed several conversations that left him uneasy. Questions about ownership, questions about financial authority, questions about what would happen if I could no longer manage the house on my own. He did not mention names. That detail stood out immediately. Thomas was never interested in accusations. He believed in evidence, facts, patterns, not assumptions. Then I reached a sentence that made me stop reading altogether. If you are holding this letter, do not assume everyone around you understands what I arranged before my death. I lowered the paper and stared across the room. Arranged what? The question echoed through my mind. I looked back into the envelope. The remaining documents suddenly seemed far more important than I originally assumed. Yet before opening them, I found myself thinking about the years after Thomas died. At first, everyone seemed supportive. My son Ryan visited frequently. Melissa checked on me often. Friends brought food. Neighbors offered help. Gradually, however, things changed. Ryan became busier with work. Visits became shorter. Phone calls became less frequent. Melissa remained attentive, but looking back, I noticed something curious. Many of her conversations eventually drifted toward practical matters. The house, finances, long-term planning. She often asked whether maintaining such a large property was becoming difficult. She suggested retirement communities more than once. At the time, I appreciated her concern. Now those memories felt different. The letter continued with another warning. Thomas wrote that if anything ever felt unusual, I should review every document carefully and seek answers before making major decisions. The wording was calm, but unmistakably deliberate. He wanted me to pay attention. I slowly placed the letter on the desk and reached for the first folder beneath it. The label on the front read Property Records. My stomach tightened. Through the window, sunlight was beginning to fade as evening approached. The room seemed darker now, smaller somehow. I opened the folder and immediately saw a series of legal filings dated less than a year before Thomas passed away. Whatever my husband had been trying to protect, it appeared to be connected directly to our home. And judging by the seriousness of his letter, he believed someone might eventually try to convince me otherwise. For several moments, I sat motionless with the folder open in front of me. The study had grown noticeably darker, and the last traces of daylight stretched across the floor in long golden bands. Yet I barely noticed. My attention was fixed entirely on the documents resting on Thomas's desk. The first page appeared to be an ordinary property filing. I adjusted my reading glasses and leaned closer. Then I noticed the date. The document had been filed 8 months before Thomas passed away. My pulse quickened. I continued reading slowly. Every line seemed more important than the last. According to the filing, Thomas had transferred full ownership of our home directly to me while he was still alive. Not after his death. Not through a future inheritance arrangement. Not through a trust that would activate later. The house legally became mine before he died. I stared at the document in disbelief. Then I read it again. And then a third time. The wording never changed. The meaning never changed. The house belonged entirely to me. A strange mixture of relief and confusion washed over me. Over the years, Melissa often spoke about the home as though it would eventually become Ryan's responsibility. She never said anything directly. Instead, she made small comments here and there. Questions about long-term planning. Questions about future ownership. Questions about what would happen if I ever decided to move. At the time, I assumed she was simply being practical. Now I was no longer sure. I continued sorting through the folder. Beneath the ownership filing sat several copies of correspondence between Thomas and an attorney. Most appeared routine until I noticed a section highlighted in yellow. One sentence immediately caught my attention. Retain duplicate records in a secure location separate from primary household files. My stomach tightened. Duplicate records. Secure location. Thomas had not hidden an envelope inside a wall because he was sentimental. He had hidden it because he believed those records might someday become important. I turned the page. Then another. Finally, I found something that made my hands go cold. Attached to the back of the folder was a photocopy of a property summary sheet. At first glance, it looked almost identical to the ownership record I had just reviewed. Then I noticed a crucial difference. This version referenced a future ownership structure involving Ryan. I compared the two documents side by side. They could not both represent the final arrangement. One clearly stated that I was the sole owner. The other suggested a future path that would eventually place the property elsewhere. My heart began beating faster. I was not an attorney, but I knew enough to recognize that something did not fit. The longer I stared at the pages, the more uncomfortable I became. Then I noticed a small handwritten note clipped to the corner. It was written in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting. Trust signed filings. Never trust copies shown without verification. I read the sentence twice. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Thomas had anticipated confusion. He had expected conflicting information to exist. More importantly, he expected me to discover it one day. My thoughts immediately drifted back through the years. Melissa suggesting that managing a large property alone could become difficult. Melissa asking whether I had updated important paperwork. Melissa mentioning retirement communities more than once. Each memory returned sharper than before. Individually, the conversations meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Just as I reached for the next document, my cell phone rang. The sudden sound startled me. I glanced at the screen and immediately felt my stomach tighten. The caller was Melissa, and for the first time since Thomas died, I hesitated before answering. The phone continued ringing while I stared at Melissa's name on the screen. Under normal circumstances, I would have answered immediately. She had been part of the family for nearly 15 years. Yet something about the timing unsettled me. I had spent the last hour uncovering documents that raised questions I never expected to ask. And now, at that exact moment, Melissa was calling. I finally pressed the answer button and held the phone to my ear. "Hello, Melissa." Her voice sounded warm and cheerful. "Evelyn, I hope I am not interrupting anything." I glanced around the study. Property records, legal correspondence, and Thomas's letter remained spread across the desk. "No," I replied carefully. "I was just cleaning." "Cleaning?" she repeated. "That sounds productive." There was a brief pause. Then she asked a question that immediately caught my attention. "Were you going through Thomas's old things?" The room suddenly felt smaller. I forced myself to keep my voice steady. "A little," I said. "Why do you ask?" Melissa laughed softly. "No reason. I just know he kept everything. Old files, papers, receipts. Sometimes I wonder how anyone could find anything in there." Another pause followed. This one felt longer, more deliberate. Then came the question that made my stomach tighten. "You have not found any old envelopes, have you?" For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. Not documents. Not files. Not records. Envelopes. The specific word echoed through my mind. My eyes drifted toward the yellowed envelope resting on Thomas's desk. I suddenly became very aware of my heartbeat. "Why would I find an envelope?" I asked lightly. Melissa laughed again, but the sound felt forced. "Oh, nothing important. Just curious." Curious. It was a word she used often. Curious about finances. Curious about the house. Curious about future plans. I had never questioned it before. Now I found myself paying attention to every detail. We spoke for another minute about ordinary things. Weather. Grocery shopping. Ryan's work schedule. Then she ended the call. The moment the line disconnected, silence returned to the room. I stared at the phone for several seconds before setting it down. My thoughts raced. Melissa knew something. Maybe not everything. Maybe not exactly what was hidden. But she knew enough to ask about an envelope before I had told anyone what I found. The realization sent a chill through me. I sat down and tried to think clearly. Over the years, Melissa had always presented herself as organized and responsible. She remembered birthdays, planned holidays, managed family schedules. Everyone admired her attention to detail, including me. Yet looking back now, another pattern began emerging. Melissa always seemed unusually interested in information. She wanted to know who updated their wills, who refinanced their homes, who changed insurance policies, who sold property. At the time, I considered it harmless curiosity. Now I was not so sure. My thoughts drifted through years of conversations. Melissa suggesting that a large house could become difficult to manage alone. Melissa recommending retirement communities with maintenance-free living. Melissa mentioning that simplifying life could reduce stress. Each conversation seemed reasonable on its own. Together, however, they formed something more troubling. I looked back at the documents on Thomas's desk. Then I reached for the next folder in the envelope. The label on the tab read Attorney Correspondence. If Thomas hid all of this for a reason, then somewhere inside these records lay the answer to the question that now refused to leave my mind. How did Melissa know enough to ask about an envelope she should never have known existed? For the next hour, I sat alone in the study reviewing every page inside the folder labeled Attorney Correspondence. The deeper I went, the more I understood why Thomas had hidden the envelope so carefully. These were not ordinary records. They were conversations, instructions, and legal notes spanning the final year of his life. Most were routine. Estate planning updates, property confirmations, requests for duplicate copies of important documents. Then I reached a letter addressed to his attorney that immediately caught my attention. The date was only 6 months before he passed away. Thomas had written a specific request asking that certified copies of ownership records be stored outside the house. He wanted duplicate files maintained in a separate secure location. My pulse quickened as I continued reading. The wording remained calm and professional, but the message beneath it was unmistakable. Thomas was preparing for a situation he believed might eventually occur. He was creating safeguards. I turned another page. Attached behind the letter was a memorandum prepared by the attorney. Several sections had been highlighted. One paragraph stopped me cold. According to the memo, someone had contacted the attorney's office asking questions about future property transfers and decision-making authority after Thomas's death. The identity of the caller was not listed in the summary, but the timing immediately caught my attention. The inquiry occurred less than 4 months after the funeral. I stared at the page for several moments. For months. At that point, I was still struggling through grief. Most days I could barely manage grocery shopping without feeling overwhelmed. Yet someone was already asking detailed questions about ownership and authority. My stomach tightened. Then I remembered something. Several years ago, Melissa offered to help organize paperwork after Ryan complained that I was keeping too many old records. At the time, I appreciated the gesture. She sorted files, labeled folders, and created storage boxes. I thought she was helping me. Now I found myself wondering how much information she saw during those afternoons. The thought unsettled me. I reached for another document. This one was shorter, just a single page, yet it contained a sentence that made me sit upright in my chair. The attorney recorded that the caller specifically asked whether ownership arrangements could be altered if an elderly homeowner later moved into assisted living. My heart began beating faster. Assisted living. The phrase immediately brought back dozens of conversations I had nearly forgotten. Melissa mentioning retirement communities. Melissa praising maintenance-free living. Melissa talking about safety and convenience. Individually, each conversation sounded caring. Together, they suddenly felt very different. I set the paper down and stared out the study window. Evening. Shadows stretched across the backyard. The old oak tree Thomas planted when Ryan was born swayed gently in the breeze. For years, I assumed my family was simply concerned about my future. Now I was beginning to wonder whether concern had become mixed with something else. Something harder to define. Something Thomas noticed before I ever did. Just as I reached for the next file, a business card slipped from between the pages and landed on the desk. It belonged to Thomas's attorney. On the back, written in my husband's handwriting, was a short note. If anything feels wrong, speak with him before trusting anyone else's version of the story. I read the sentence twice. Then I looked at the phone sitting on the corner of the desk. The questions were multiplying faster than the answers. And for the first time since finding the envelope, I realized I was no longer simply reading about the past. I was following a trail that Thomas deliberately left behind, one clue at a time. The next morning, I called the number on the business card before I could talk myself out of it. The attorney answered personally. His name was Richard Hayes, and the moment I introduced myself, a long silence followed. Then he said something that immediately caught my attention. Evelyn, I was beginning to wonder if you would ever find what Thomas left behind. My heart skipped a beat. We arranged to meet that afternoon. The drive across town felt unusually long. Every red light seemed to give me another minute to think. Another minute to wonder what Thomas knew that I did not. By the time I arrived at Richard's office, I felt as though I was carrying the weight of several years instead of several folders. Richard greeted me warmly and led me into a private conference room. The moment I placed Thomas's envelope on the table, he nodded. Then you have reached the point where he wanted you to know more. The words sent a chill through me. I sat down and opened my notebook. Richard began reviewing events from the final year of Thomas's life. Most of what he described matched the documents I had already seen. Questions about ownership, requests for duplicate records, instructions to preserve legal filings. Then he opened a file cabinet and removed a thick folder. There is something else Thomas asked me to keep, he said. The folder contained financial records. At first glance, they appeared ordinary. Property taxes, insurance payments, routine expenses. Then Richard pointed toward a series of highlighted entries. The transactions were not large individually. A few $100s here, several hundred there. Spread over multiple years, they seemed easy to overlook. Yet together they formed a pattern. Do these account numbers look familiar? He asked. I studied the pages carefully. One of the receiving accounts was attached to a business registration. Richard handed me another document. The business name meant nothing to me at first. Then I reached the owner information and felt my stomach tighten. Melissa Carter. I stared at the page for several seconds. The business had been registered 3 years earlier. Around the same time, Melissa often spoke about starting a consulting company. Ryan was proud of her. The entire family supported her efforts. I even remember sending flowers on the day she launched it. Never once did I imagine her company would appear inside financial records connected to my household. Richard remained quiet while I reviewed the documents. Finally, I looked up. Are you saying money was transferred there? He nodded carefully. I am saying there were transactions that Thomas found unusual enough to document. The distinction mattered. Richard was a lawyer. He chose his words carefully. Even so, the records were difficult to ignore. The transfers stretched across nearly 3 years. Together, they totaled more than $36,000. I leaned back in my chair and tried to think clearly. Suddenly, memories began resurfacing. During Thomas's illness, there was a period when Melissa helped me manage online bill payments. At the time, I struggled with new banking systems and account passwords. She offered assistance whenever I became confused. I trusted her completely. The realization made my chest tighten. Richard slid another page across the table. It contained a handwritten note from Thomas. Short, direct, unmistakably his. Follow the money before believing anyone's explanation. I read the sentence twice. Then I looked back at the financial records. For the first time since finding the envelope, the questions were no longer abstract. There was now a trail, a measurable trail. And if Thomas had gone to such lengths to preserve it, then somewhere further ahead waited a truth he believed I would eventually need to face. That evening, I returned home carrying copies of every document Richard provided. The sky was already dark, and a cold wind swept fallen leaves across the driveway as I pulled into the garage. For the first time since discovering Thomas's envelope, I felt as though I was standing on the edge of something much larger than a simple family misunderstanding. The evidence was no longer pointing in one direction by coincidence. Too many pieces were beginning to fit together. I carried the folders into the study and spread them across the desk beneath the reading lamp. Financial records, property filings, attorney correspondence. Thomas had spent months, perhaps years, preserving a trail for me to follow. Yet one question remained unanswered. Why did he seem so certain that I would eventually need all of this? As I organized the papers, I noticed something I had overlooked before. Tucked into the bottom of the original envelope was a smaller sealed packet. It was thin, no larger than a greeting card. Across the front, written in Thomas's familiar handwriting, were 4 words. Open only after meeting Richard. My pulse quickened immediately. I had followed his instructions without even realizing it. Slowly, I broke the seal and unfolded the contents. Inside was a short letter and a small flash drive. My hands trembled slightly. The letter was brief. Evelyn, if you have reached this point, then you have already learned enough to ask the right questions. What remains is not proof of wrongdoing. It is proof of why I worried. Watch the recording. I stared at the flash drive for several moments. Then I crossed the room, turned on my laptop, and inserted it. A single video file appeared on the screen. The recording date caught my attention immediately. It had been created less than 2 months before Thomas passed away. My heart began beating faster. I clicked play. The screen flickered. Then Thomas appeared. Seeing him move and speak after nearly 5 years felt almost unreal. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. He looked older than I remembered. Tired, but completely clear-minded. He smiled gently when the recording began. "Hello, Evelyn," he said. The sound of his voice brought tears to my eyes. He spoke calmly, just as he always had. He explained that the recording existed because written documents sometimes fail to capture intentions. He wanted me to hear his concerns directly from him. Then his expression became more serious. He described a growing pattern during the final year of his life. Repeated conversations about property, repeated questions about authority, repeated attempts to understand how decisions might be made if I ever became unable to manage things myself. He never mentioned Melissa by name. In fact, he never accused anyone of anything. That was exactly who Thomas was. Instead, he focused on observations, facts, patterns. Then he said something that sent a chill through me. I discovered that people often reveal their priorities long before they reveal their intentions. I sat perfectly still. The room felt silent except for his voice. Thomas continued. He explained that after noticing these patterns, he instructed attorneys to create duplicate records, preserve ownership filings, and maintain independent documentation. Not because he knew something bad would happen, because he believed preparation was wiser than regret. Then he looked directly into the camera. His eyes seemed almost alive despite the years that had passed. If anyone ever tries to persuade you that giving up control is the easiest option, stop and ask who benefits from that decision. I felt tears forming again. The recording ended moments later. The screen went dark. Yet one thing remained illuminated in my mind. Thomas had not left me a map to expose someone. He had left me a map to protect myself. And somewhere within the remaining records on my desk, I was beginning to suspect there was still one final piece of the story waiting to be found. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. Thomas's words from the recording remained with me long after I turned off the laptop. If anyone ever tries to persuade you that giving up control is the easiest option, stop and ask who benefits from that decision. The sentence echoed through my thoughts as I sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee and reviewing my notes. For days, I had been gathering pieces of a puzzle. Property records, attorney correspondence, financial transactions, a hidden letter, a recorded message. Yet I still felt as though one crucial piece was missing. Thomas clearly believed I would eventually discover something important, something specific. Around mid-morning, I returned to the study and began sorting through the remaining papers one final time. Most of the documents were already familiar. Then I noticed a thin folder tucked inside the back of the envelope. Somehow I had overlooked it before. The folder contained only a few pages, but one immediately caught my attention. It was a memorandum prepared by Richard Hayes after a consultation several years earlier. I adjusted my reading glasses and began reading carefully. At first, the contents seemed routine. General discussions about estate planning, property ownership, future considerations. Then I reached a section highlighted in yellow. My heart began beating faster. The memorandum recorded a question asked during a consultation. Not a question about taxes, not a question about maintenance, not even a question about inheritance. It was a question about timing. Specifically, how quickly property ownership arrangements might change if an elderly homeowner entered assisted living. I stared at the page for several seconds. Then I read it again. The wording was clear, direct, impossible to misunderstand. A second document attached to the memorandum identified who had asked the question. Melissa Carter. I felt a chill move through me. Suddenly, dozens of conversations from the past 5 years came rushing back. Melissa recommending retirement communities. Melissa praising maintenance-free living. Melissa explaining how much easier life would become if I no longer had to manage the house. At the time, I believed she was concerned about my well-being. Now I saw those conversations differently. Not because moving into assisted living is wrong. It is not. Many people make that decision for good reasons. What disturbed me was the pattern, the repeated focus, the timing, the fact that questions about my future often appeared alongside questions about property and ownership. I continued reading. Additional notes documented several follow-up inquiries over the following months. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. Yet the consistency was impossible to ignore. The same themes appeared again and again. Future authority, property transitions, simplifying financial control. By the time I finished reading, the room felt completely silent. I leaned back in my chair and stared out the window. The old oak tree in the backyard swayed gently in the breeze. For years, I had assumed Thomas was being overly cautious. Now I understood something important. He was not protecting the house. He was protecting me, protecting my ability to make my own decisions, protecting my independence, protecting my future. My phone buzzed on the desk. A text message from Ryan appeared on the screen. Melissa and I were thinking about stopping by this weekend. We have not seen you in a while. I stared at the message for a long moment. Then I looked back at the documents spread across the desk. The timing felt almost surreal. For the first time since discovering the envelope, I felt completely certain about what I needed to do next. The truth was no longer hidden inside old files and forgotten records. The truth was sitting in front of me. And before this was over, it would be sitting in front of them too. Saturday arrived with clear skies and cool autumn air. I spent the morning preparing lunch the way I always had when family visited. A pot of soup simmered on the stove. Fresh bread cooled on the counter. From the outside, nothing about the day looked unusual. Yet every time I walked past the study, I thought about the documents waiting inside. By noon, everything was ready. The property records were organized. The attorney correspondence was arranged in chronological order. The financial records sat inside a separate folder. Thomas's letter and the flash drive remained safely stored in my desk drawer. For days, I had been gathering pieces of the truth. Now I was preparing to place them all in one room. Shortly after 1 o'clock, Ryan and Melissa arrived. Ryan hugged me warmly as soon as he stepped through the front door. Melissa smiled and handed me a small bouquet of flowers. To anyone watching, we looked like an ordinary family sharing an ordinary weekend meal. In many ways, that was exactly what made the situation so painful. We sat together in the dining room and talked about everyday things. Work schedules, local events, neighbors, the weather. For nearly an hour, the conversation felt comfortable, familiar. Several times, I caught myself remembering family gatherings from years earlier when life seemed simpler. Then, just as lunch was ending, Melissa glanced around the dining room and smiled. "This house still looks wonderful," she said. "You have done an amazing job keeping everything up." I thanked her politely. She nodded and continued. "Although I imagine it must be a lot of work for one person." There it was again. The same theme, the same concern, the same gentle suggestion wrapped in kindness. Ryan looked down at his plate. Melissa continued talking about convenience, maintenance, and future planning. Her voice remained calm and pleasant. If I did not know everything I had learned over the past week, I might have interpreted her words exactly the way I always had. As concern, as care, as family. Instead, I listened carefully. When she finished, I folded my hands and smiled. "Actually," I said, "I have been doing quite a bit of planning myself lately." Ryan looked surprised. Melissa's expression changed slightly. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. I stood and walked toward the study. A moment later, I returned carrying several folders. The room grew quiet. Ryan frowned. Melissa sat perfectly still. I placed the folders on the dining room table one at a time. Property records, attorney correspondence, financial statements. Then I sat down again. "A few weeks ago," I said calmly, "I found something your father left behind." Ryan immediately looked confused. Melissa did not move at all. I opened the first folder and slid the certified ownership records across the table. Ryan picked them up and began reading. The confusion on his face quickly deepened. "Mom," he said quietly, "what is this?" I met his eyes. "It is proof that your father transferred full ownership of this house to me before he died." Ryan looked down at the papers again. Across from him, Melissa's smile disappeared. I reached for the second folder. The attorney records, the notes, the questions, the memorandums. Every carefully preserved piece of information Thomas left behind. For the first time since discovering the hidden envelope, I felt completely calm. The truth no longer belonged inside secret compartments, forgotten files, or private suspicions. The truth was finally sitting at the table with all of us. And before this conversation ended, every remaining question would have an answer. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Ryan continued staring at the property records while Melissa sat perfectly still across the table. The cheerful atmosphere that existed only minutes earlier had completely vanished. I could almost feel the weight of Thomas's documents settling over the room. Ryan finally looked up. "Mom, I do not understand," he said quietly. "Why would Dad hide all of this?" His voice carried genuine confusion. Not defensiveness, not anger, confusion. I looked at my son and realized something important. Whatever mistakes had been made over the years, he seemed just as surprised as I was by many of the details sitting on the table. "That is exactly what I wanted to discuss," I replied calmly. I opened the second folder and removed several pages of attorney correspondence. The documents were arranged carefully in chronological order. Notes, memorandums, records of inquiries, questions that had been asked long after Thomas passed away. Ryan picked up the first page and began reading. Across from him, Melissa's expression remained controlled, but I noticed her fingers tighten around the edge of her napkin. As Ryan continued reading, his eyes narrowed. Then he reached one of the highlighted sections. "Melissa," he asked quietly. She looked up. "What is this?" He turned the document toward her. The memorandum described questions submitted to Richard Hayes regarding future property transfers and authority arrangements. Melissa glanced at the page and immediately looked away. "I was trying to understand our options," she said. Her answer came quickly, almost automatically. Ryan frowned. Our options. She hesitated. I was thinking about the future. About planning. The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface. Years earlier, I probably would have accepted it without another thought. But now there were too many pieces on the table. Too many questions. Too many patterns. I reached for another document. This time it was the memorandum I discovered the previous day. The one that recorded a specific question about how quickly ownership arrangements might change if an elderly homeowner entered assisted living. The room grew quiet again as I slid the paper across the table. Ryan read it once, then a second time. The color slowly drained from his face. "Melissa," he said softly, "you asked this." She lowered her eyes. "It was just a question. About my mother moving into assisted living?" Ryan's voice sounded strained. Years before she ever mentioned wanting anything like that? Melissa shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I was planning ahead." Ryan stared at her in disbelief. I remained silent. There was no need to argue. The documents spoke clearly enough. Then I opened the final folder. The financial records. Carefully organized. Date after date. Transaction after transaction. Notes preserved by Richard. Records preserved by Thomas. I placed them in front of Ryan. He reviewed the pages slowly. Very slowly. Then he stopped. His eyes fixed on the business registration attached to the file. Melissa's business. The same company linked to the transfers Thomas documented years earlier. Ryan looked up. "Why is your company connected to these records?" The question hung in the air. Melissa did not answer immediately. For the first time that afternoon, she seemed genuinely unsure of what to say. Outside, a cool breeze rustled leaves against the dining room window. Inside, the silence felt almost unbearable. Finally, Melissa opened her mouth to speak. But before she could say a single word, I reached into my purse and removed the flash drive containing Thomas's final recording. I placed it gently on the table between us. Then I looked directly at both of them. "Before anyone explains anything," I said quietly, "there is one more thing your father wanted us to hear." Neither Ryan nor Melissa spoke as I connected the flash drive to my laptop. The dining room felt unusually quiet. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed louder than usual. I turned the screen so both of them could see it clearly, then pressed play. A moment later, Thomas appeared on the screen. The years seemed to disappear from Ryan's face the instant he heard his father's voice. He sat perfectly still. Melissa lowered her eyes. Thomas smiled gently at the camera before beginning. "If you are watching this together, then Evelyn has probably discovered the things I hoped she would never need to find." The room remained silent. Thomas continued speaking in the calm, measured way I remembered so well. He explained that throughout his life, he believed preparation was one of the greatest gifts a person could leave behind. Preparation for illness. Preparation for hardship. Preparation for truth. Then his expression became more serious. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "I never found proof that anyone intended to harm Evelyn. But I found enough questions, enough curiosity, and enough interest in controlling future decisions that I became concerned." Ryan lowered his head. Melissa stared at the table. Thomas continued. He described the conversations that troubled him. The repeated discussions about authority. The repeated focus on property. The repeated attempts to understand what might happen if Evelyn became unable to manage her own affairs. Then came the part that changed everything. Thomas explained that after noticing those patterns, he instructed Richard Hayes to document every unusual inquiry related to the house and to preserve copies of all significant conversations. Ryan looked up immediately. His attention sharpened. The video continued. "There was one conversation in particular that stayed with me," Thomas said. "Not because it was illegal, not because it was aggressive, because it revealed priorities." My heart began beating faster, even though I already knew where this was heading. Thomas looked directly into the camera. Someone asked how quickly ownership of the house could be transferred if Evelyn moved into assisted living. That question told me more than any explanation ever could. The room felt frozen. Ryan slowly turned toward Melissa. She remained completely still. There was no anger in his face, only disbelief. The video ended several moments later. Silence settled over the dining room. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody argued. Finally, Ryan broke the silence. "Melissa," he said quietly, "why were you asking questions like that?" She stared at her hands for several seconds before answering. "Because I thought I was planning ahead." The explanation sounded weak even to her. Ryan shook his head slowly. "Planning ahead for what?" Melissa swallowed hard. For the future. For the house. For our family. Ryan looked down at the documents spread across the table. The financial records. The attorney memorandums. The property filings. Piece by piece, the entire picture sat before him. Then I reached for one final document Richard had given me. It was a memorandum summarizing multiple consultations over several years. Several sections were highlighted. Together, they showed a consistent pattern. Questions about property. Questions about authority. Questions about transitions. The same themes appearing again and again. Ryan read every page in complete silence. When he finally looked up, something had changed in his expression. The confusion was gone. The uncertainty was gone. For the first time all afternoon, he seemed to understand exactly why his father had hidden an envelope inside a wall and spent years preserving a trail of evidence for the woman he loved most. The silence that followed felt different from every other silence that afternoon. Earlier, there had been confusion, then disbelief, then painful realization. Now there was only truth. It rested on the dining room table beside Thomas's documents, his recordings, and the evidence he spent years preserving. Ryan sat motionless, staring at the final memorandum. Across from him, Melissa looked exhausted. The confidence she carried into the house was gone. The explanations were gone. There was nothing left to hide behind. Finally, Ryan spoke. "Why did you never tell me?" His voice was quiet, but the disappointment inside it filled the room. Melissa lowered her eyes. "Because every year it became harder to admit how far I had drifted from the person I wanted to be." Nobody answered immediately. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the table, illuminating the folders one last time. Then I reached for a final envelope that Richard Hayes had given me 3 days earlier. Until that moment, I had not opened it. I slid the contents onto the table. Ryan frowned. Melissa looked up. Inside was a copy of a revised estate plan I had completed that morning. Ryan looked confused. "Mom," I smiled gently. "Your father spent years protecting my right to choose my own future. It is time I honored that gift." I handed him the document. He began reading. The revised plan confirmed that the house would remain under my control for the rest of my life. If I ever chose to sell it, move, or remain there, the decision would belong entirely to me. No future ownership expectations would influence that choice. More importantly, a substantial portion of my estate would now be directed toward a local scholarship fund and a community program supporting widows who struggled after losing their spouses. Ryan looked up in surprise. Melissa remained silent. "This is not punishment," I said softly. "This is freedom." They listened quietly. For years, people treated this house as though it were the story. It never was. The story was whether I would keep the right to decide what happens to my own life. I paused and looked at Thomas's photograph resting on the sideboard. "Your father understood that long before I did." Ryan slowly folded the document and set it down. Then he stood and walked around the table. His eyes were filled with regret. "Mom, I am sorry," he said. "I should have paid closer attention. I should have asked more questions." I hugged him. "I know, and I meant it." The greatest mistake he made was not greed. It was absence. He stopped paying attention while someone else quietly shaped the conversation. Across the room, Melissa wiped away tears. "I never wanted this to happen," she whispered. I looked at her for a long moment. Neither did Thomas. The words were not cruel. They were simply true. A short time later, Ryan and Melissa left together. No one shouted. No one slammed doors. The truth had already accomplished what anger never could. When the house became quiet again, I returned to the study. The hidden compartment remained open behind the wall panel. I carefully placed Thomas's letter back inside, along with copies of the documents that had protected me. Then I closed the compartment for the final time. The secret had fulfilled its purpose. Not because it exposed weakness in others, because it reminded me of strength in myself. As evening settled over the house, I sat in Thomas's chair and looked around the room he loved so much. The books remained on the shelves. The old desk remained by the window. The memories remained exactly where they had always been. But something inside me had changed. For the first time in years, my future was no longer being quietly discussed by other people. It belonged entirely to me. And that, more than any house, document, or inheritance, was the greatest gift Thomas ever left behind.